America's greatest secret war wasn't against Germany or Japan. It was between its own spies. The story of America's intelligence services during World War II is usually told as a heroic tale of secret agents, exotic missions, and code-breaking brilliance. But the real story is far messier, far more human, and far more dangerous. Behind closed doors in offices that smelled of ink, coffee, and cigarette smoke, a war was being waged that few knew about. A war between America's own spy agencies, the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, and the established Federal Bureau of Investigation. The rivalry was invisible to the public, but it shaped decisions that affected every theater of war, every operation overseas, and sometimes every life. It began not with bullets or bombs, but with suspicion. The OSS had been created in 1942 by William "Wild Bill" Donovan, a lawyer and decorated World War I veteran who believed the United States needed a centralized intelligence service to match Britain's MI6. Donovan imagined an agency that could gather intelligence, organize resistance networks, and conduct covert operations behind enemy lines. The men he recruited were diverse: lawyers, journalists, soldiers, adventurers, and Donovan was willing to bend rules to achieve results. The OSS moved quickly, improvising offices, training programs, and operational protocols. Its agents were taught to improvise, to deceive, and to vanish. The FBI, on the other hand, was older, more established, and fiercely bureaucratic. Edgar Hoover had spent decades building the Bureau into an organization devoted to law enforcement, counterintelligence, and the meticulous gathering of evidence. Hoover distrusted the OSS instinctively. He considered Donovan's agents reckless, undisciplined, and dangerously autonomous. While the OSS embraced secrecy and risk, the FBI valued procedure, chain of command, and exhaustive documentation. Where Donovan saw opportunity, Hoover saw liability, and this philosophical difference quickly became personal. The first clashes were subtle. OSS officers arriving in Washington found themselves blocked from documents, denied access to contacts, and met with hostility from senior FBI agents. Hoover monitored every move Donovan made, convinced that the new agency's existence undermined national security. Donovan, in turn, distrusted Hoover's obsession with paperwork and feared that the Bureau's rigid hierarchy would slow down missions that required split-second decisions. The tension escalated quietly at first, through terse memos and pointed questions at meetings. But as the OSS expanded its reach into Europe, Africa, and Asia, the stakes became life and death. The rivalry was not merely bureaucratic. It quickly entered operational territory. OSS agents abroad often depended on contacts and resources within the United States that the FBI controlled. Travel papers, communications channels, and intelligence reports were frequently delayed or withheld. OSS operatives found themselves competing with FBI agents who seemed determined to control information rather than protect it. In some cases, agents on the ground reported being shadowed by Americans, watching their own movements as if they were enemies. The line between professional caution and active obstruction blurred. The conflict was particularly acute in Europe. The OSS had recruited Americans with language skills, military experience, and knowledge of European terrain to act as field agents and liaisons with resistance groups. These men and women were sent behind enemy lines to gather intelligence, train local partisans, and sabotage Axis operations. They relied on radio communications, clandestine airdrops, and forged papers. But the FBI, fearing subversion and espionage on American soil, began instructing its overseas attachés to monitor OSS communications and personnel. Some FBI officers even attempted to redirect operations or question agents' loyalty. Field agents quickly realized that their own government was sometimes the greater threat. In North Africa, OSS teams found themselves colliding with FBI operatives who were ostensibly there to support Allied intelligence. A small OSS team preparing to sabotage Axis fuel depots in Tunisia suddenly discovered that FBI agents had taken the same objective for official inspection. The encounter was tense. Weapons were unholstered, papers were waved, and accusations flew in staccato English and French. The two sides eventually negotiated a truce, but the air of distrust lingered. Agents later described the moment as surreal, working behind enemy lines, risking capture and execution, only to have the enemy appear in the form of their own countrymen. The friction extended to London, the nerve center of Allied intelligence in Europe. OSS liaison officers found British MI6 officers cooperative, often incredulous at American secrecy failures, but FBI liaisons were different. Hoover had demanded that American operatives in London report directly to the Bureau, and his agents insisted on monitoring every dispatch. Donovan fumed at the inefficiency, believing that micromanagement was not only slowing operations but actively endangering lives. British intelligence officers, caught in the middle, often referred to the USS-FBI conflict as a civil war in miniature. One fought with memos and cold glares rather than guns. Despite the internal chaos, the OSS accomplished remarkable feats. Its agents parachuted into occupied France, sabotaged German supply lines, and built networks that helped Allied forces prepare for D-Day. Yet Hoover's FBI remained vigilant, convinced that Donovan's successes were flukes or evidence of dangerous recklessness. Agents returning to the United States found themselves interrogated by FBI officers who scrutinized every report, every action, every decision. Loyalty was measured not by courage or accomplishment, but by conformity to procedure. The ideological clash also reflected personality. Donovan thrived on improvisation, taking calculated risks and rewarding ingenuity. Hoover, in contrast, demanded absolute control, thorough documentation, and obedience to hierarchy. Where Donovan encouraged initiative, Hoover feared it. Where Donovan saw agents as flexible problem solvers, Hoover saw potential criminals. The tension reached a point where OSS officers sometimes had to disguise their own operations from FBI counterparts simply to prevent interference. The internal intelligence war was not a metaphor. It was very real, and every agent understood that the stakes were personal as well as professional. The competition extended into code breaking and cryptography. OSS operatives intercepted enemy messages and developed systems for analysis and decryption. Hoover's agents, already entrenched in domestic surveillance and counterintelligence, insisted on reviewing OSS ciphers and often delayed their dissemination to field agents. OSS analysts resented the bureaucratic interference, arguing that every minute of delay could cost lives on the front lines. Reports later described the atmosphere in Washington as electric with suspicion, with agents guarding notes and telegrams like soldiers protecting ammunition. The rivalry also reached into personnel. OSS recruitment focused on unconventional candidates, journalists who knew Europe, professors familiar with languages, adventurers skilled in survival and improvisation. FBI recruitment emphasized domestic law enforcement, character checks, and background investigations. OSS operatives often arrived overseas before FBI approval was complete, prompting Hoover to accuse Donovan of sending unvetted civilians into combat zones. Donovan, in turn, mocked Hoover's caution as paralyzing prudence. The personal animosity between the two leaders trickled down to every level of both organizations. One of the most dramatic consequences of this tension occurred in Italy. OSS agents were working with partisans in the mountains outside Rome, coordinating sabotage missions and gathering intelligence on German troop movements. The FBI, concerned about American citizens traveling overseas without supervision, sent agents to observe the OSS teams. Field operatives, already exhausted from weeks of risky missions, found themselves confronted by FBI officers demanding detailed accounts of plans that were already in motion. Delays ensued, confusion reigned, and for a brief period, a planned sabotage almost failed. Only quick improvisation by an OSS officer prevented disaster. The rivalry shaped not only wartime operations, but also post-war intelligence culture. OSS veterans, when the agency was dissolved in 1945, often carried grudges against the FBI, believing that Hoover's interference had cost American lives. Hoover, for his part, remained convinced that Donovan's agents were reckless amateurs who had benefited from luck rather than skill. These tensions laid the groundwork for decades of friction between the CIA, OSS's successor, and the FBI, echoing in later Cold War operations. At the heart of the conflict was a philosophical divide. Donovan's OSS sought to operate flexibly, creatively, and sometimes outside traditional legal frameworks in pursuit of results. Hoover's FBI emphasized legality, documentation, and strict internal oversight. Both philosophies had merit, both were rooted in genuine patriotism, yet neither could fully understand the other. Field agents learned to navigate this divide, often playing one agency against the other to achieve their objectives. In private correspondence, Donovan wrote of Hoover's obsession with control, while Hoover described Donovan's organization as chaotic, amateurish, and dangerously autonomous. Despite the internal strife, OSS agents often succeeded in extraordinary ways. In France, they helped organize the French resistance, smuggled agents and supplies across borders, and disrupted German supply chains. In Asia, OSS operatives coordinated guerrilla campaigns in Burma and China, relying on local allies and improvisation. Every success highlighted the contrast: OSS's ingenuity against the FBI's insistence on procedure. The field agents, caught between innovation and oversight, became adept at balancing secrecy with strategy, improvisation with caution, and autonomy with accountability. By the end of the war, the OSS had proven its value, but the rivalry with the FBI had left permanent scars. Many OSS veterans felt unappreciated, frustrated by Hoover's constant surveillance and interference. Hoover, meanwhile, had cemented the FBI's authority and demonstrated the power of bureaucracy to assert control over even the most clandestine operations. The war between OSS and FBI was invisible to the public, yet its effects shaped not only the outcome of wartime intelligence operations, but also the culture of American espionage for decades to come. The war in Europe was nearing its climax, but the tension between OSS and the FBI intensified as operations became more complex and stakes higher. In London, the OSS headquarters buzzed with activity, radios clicking, typewriters clattering, and agents moving swiftly between offices. Donovan had grown increasingly frustrated by the FBI's constant oversight. Every dispatch had to be copied, every mission logged, every contact reported. Field agents, meanwhile, were running operations behind enemy lines, risking capture or death, and yet the bureaucrats in Washington seemed more concerned with verifying signatures than protecting lives. The contrast between action and paperwork became a recurring nightmare for OSS officers. The situation in Italy demonstrated the lethal consequences of the rivalry. OSS teams had coordinated with partisan groups in the mountains, preparing ambushes against German supply convoys. Intelligence flowed through a network of couriers, radio operators, and local resistance fighters. Then came an unexpected visit from FBI agents, ostensibly to verify operations and personnel. The OSS operatives had to stop mid-planning, argue over objectives, and justify every move. A planned ambush that would have destroyed an enemy convoy had to be postponed, creating confusion and nearly costing lives. When the convoy passed unimpeded, both sides recognized privately the deadly cost of mistrust. In North Africa, the friction was equally intense. OSS officers were attempting to train local resistance fighters in sabotage, working under the constant threat of German reconnaissance. FBI agents, present in the region under Hoover's orders, insisted on auditing their movements. Some OSS agents discovered their own communications being monitored, not by the enemy, but by American colleagues. They had to adapt quickly, creating alternate radio channels, encrypted messages, and misdirection to keep operations alive. Every action required vigilance against two invisible threats, the Axis and one's own government. The rivalry extended into Asia, where OSS officers supported guerrilla operations in Burma and China. Donovan's agents built networks of local fighters, provided supplies, and coordinated intelligence for Allied offensives. The FBI, concerned about the presence of American civilians and potential missteps, attempted to monitor and control these field activities remotely. OSS agents found themselves receiving contradictory instructions: execute a mission swiftly or wait for FBI approval. They learned to improvise constantly, sometimes misleading American overseers to ensure objectives were met. One memorable instance occurred in China, where a female OSS operative coordinated the transport of medical supplies and intelligence documents through a series of mountain passes. She was trailed, not by Japanese patrols, but by an FBI attaché insisting on verifying the shipment's manifests. The operative had to create diversions, delay travel subtly, and complete the mission without alerting either party to the deception. Months later, she would describe it as walking a tightrope over an invisible abyss, where one misstep could lead to capture, mission failure, or conflict with her own countrymen. The conflict also played out in Washington. Donovan and Hoover exchanged memos that were polite on the surface, but dripping with tension underneath. Hoover accused Donovan of reckless operations that jeopardized national security, while Donovan labeled Hoover's insistence on control as paralyzing and counterproductive. Their exchanges became legendary among mid-level officers, who described the memos as wars of words more lethal than any battlefield. Staffers began keeping duplicate records, hiding sensitive notes, and creating unofficial communication channels to bypass the other agency. In Europe, OSS agents had to operate with heightened awareness. Parachuting into occupied France required precision, but they also had to anticipate FBI scrutiny in neutral zones. One agent, tasked with organizing a resistance cell near Lyon, discovered that FBI officers were auditing all incoming dispatches, questioning identities, and reviewing supply lists. She had to devise a cover story, fabricate travel documents, and manipulate reporting logs, all while preparing explosives and coordinating local fighters. The risk of betrayal from her own government became as real as the threat of German patrols. Even in mundane aspects, the rivalry affected morale. Office spaces in Washington, London, and North Africa became arenas of silent competition. OSS officers decorated their offices with maps, photos, and reports, signaling accomplishments to one another while keeping them hidden from the FBI. Hoover's agents, in turn, monitored OSS activity with meticulous scrutiny, noting departures, arrivals, and any irregularities in protocol. Conversations were cautious, laughter was measured, and trust became a rare commodity. The psychological toll was immense. Agents learned to compartmentalize, treating the USS-FBI conflict as another operational hazard. Field reports sometimes included coded warnings to colleagues about potential interference. Operatives carried not only the burden of mission success, but also the constant awareness that their own government could obstruct or undermine them. Letters home were carefully worded. Friends and family remained unaware of the dual dangers these agents faced. Many veterans later described the stress as more intense than direct combat. Despite the obstacles, OSS achieved extraordinary successes. In France, networks of partisans disrupted railways, ambushed convoys, and provided intelligence that directly contributed to D-Day planning. In Italy, saboteurs disabled bridges and communication lines. In Burma, Guerrilla teams coordinated with local forces to weaken Japanese supply chains. Every accomplishment, however, was shadowed by the constant reminder. The FBI was always watching, assessing, and potentially delaying the next step. Technology became another battlefield. OSS developed advanced radios, encrypted communications, and innovative sabotage techniques. Hoover's agents insisted on inspecting every device, every codebook, often delaying deployment. In some cases, OSS officers had to smuggle equipment past their own countrymen to maintain operational security. Radios hidden in crates, microfilm sewn into clothing, and encoded messages sent under the guise of routine correspondence became standard practice. Agents learned to navigate these complex logistics with ingenuity and precision. In London, Donovan cultivated relationships with British intelligence officers, who often expressed frustration at the American infighting. MI6 officers observed the clashes between OSS and FBI agents with bemusement, sometimes intervening subtly to ensure missions succeeded. British officers referred to the conflict as a civil war of procedure, a war fought with memos, approvals, and oversight rather than guns. Yet the consequences were tangible: delays, missed opportunities, and heightened risk to agents on the ground. The personal dimension of the rivalry was unavoidable. Donovan and Hoover loomed over every mission, influencing morale, decision-making, and strategy. OSS officers admired Donovan's vision but feared reprisal from Hoover. FBI agents respected Hoover's authority but often questioned the competence of Donovan's teams. Field agents, caught in the middle, developed extraordinary resilience, learning to adapt to unpredictable oversight while remaining focused on mission objectives. One extraordinary incident occurred in North Africa, where OSS operatives intercepted critical intelligence about German troop movements. They coordinated a successful ambush with Allied forces. Simultaneously, FBI agents requested verification, questioning the chain of custody for the information. The delay lasted hours, enough to put operatives in danger. The ambush succeeded nonetheless, but the tension between agencies intensified. Each operation became a delicate dance, balancing speed, secrecy, and bureaucracy. As the war progressed, both agencies adapted. Donovan's OSS developed internal protocols to shield field operations from FBI scrutiny, using covert reporting channels and compartmentalized communication. Hoover's FBI tightened internal control, emphasizing documentation, personnel tracking, and counterintelligence. Field agents became masters of improvisation, deception, and discretion, ensuring mission success despite bureaucratic obstacles. The rivalry persisted even as the European theater drew to a close. OSS teams in liberated territories continued to gather intelligence, assist displaced civilians, and secure sensitive materials. FBI agents remained vigilant, auditing operations and monitoring American personnel abroad. Both sides believed they were protecting national security, yet the friction remained palpable. Veterans later recalled conversations where agents joked about being attacked by ghosts, referring to interference from their own government. In the Pacific Theater, OSS operatives worked with guerrilla forces in the Philippines, China, and Burma. Coordinating supplies, intelligence, and sabotage required constant innovation. Yet Hoover's instructions sometimes arrived weeks later, demanding clarifications, approvals, or additional reporting. OSS officers learned to anticipate interference, create redundancies, and maintain operational secrecy. The dual pressures of enemy forces and domestic oversight tested their ingenuity and endurance to the maximum. By 1945, the war was nearing an end, but the consequences of the OSS-FBI rivalry remained. Donovan's agency had proved its operational value, yet Hoover had cemented the FBI's authority. Agents returning home carried stories of heroic missions, bureaucratic battles, and invisible conflicts that shaped every decision they made. Letters, reports, and official documents were scrutinized, censored, or suppressed. The public would learn little of the internal struggles, though these conflicts had real impact on strategy and outcomes. Even after the OSS was dissolved in 1945, its veterans remembered the rivalry. Many felt unrecognized, frustrated by Hoover's oversight, and determined to document their experiences. Hoover, meanwhile, maintained a tight grip on the FBI's authority and sought to control historical narratives. The seeds of future intelligence conflicts between the CIA and FBI were sown during these years, with lessons about trust, autonomy, and oversight shaping the culture of American espionage for decades. The story of OSS versus FBI is ultimately a story of human ambition, institutional philosophy, and the delicate balance between innovation and control. It is a tale of bravery and ingenuity shadowed by suspicion and rivalry. While the public celebrated victories against foreign enemies, behind the scenes, America's spies navigated an equally perilous war with each other. A war fought not with bullets but with bureaucracy, secrecy, and relentless scrutiny. Their experiences illustrate that in intelligence, as in life, the greatest threats are sometimes not outside but within, and that courage often means balancing mission, conscience, and the unpredictable motives of colleagues in power.